So in chapter 3, Stengers introduces us to some of Whitehead's key ideas, like apprehension, actual occasion, society. But she really wants to emphasize that Whitehead's philosophy is not a finished doctrine that we are to take up. It's rather an attempt to cultivate vigilance to our own modes of abstraction, to the ways in which our characterizations of reality emphasize some features and push others into the background. And what are the effects of these abstractions, these perspectives that we engage in when we do science, when we do philosophy? So she's really emphasizing the Whiteheadian method, and she's introducing his concepts, but as she says, and she was originally trained as a chemist, we're supposed to engage with Whitehead's concepts as tools, akin to the catalysts that chemists would use to produce reactions in compounds. And so we're really, we're working with the material of experience, and the concepts that we choose elicit certain features in the texture of experience, right, while backgrounding others. And we need to learn to attend to this, because modern science, in its rush to mathematize and mechanize the natural world, has not attended to the consequences of its abstractions, right? Because science, as we've learned in the first couple of modules here, is not just a neutral observation of an external world. Science is technoscience. Science transforms the world as it knows it, right? As Whitehead will say in Modes of Thought, as we think, we live, right? Our modes of thought transform the basis of our lives and have an effect on how the world becomes in the future, right? So Stengers begins chapter 3 by returning to this important theme of common sense, and she describes the way that the brooding of common sense over aspects of existence is always going to transcend our finite understanding, right? Because existence itself is not an object of knowledge. As Kant would say, existence is not a predicate, right? It's vaguer than that. It's not something we can easily put into words or verbalize, but nonetheless we feel or we enjoy existence. It has importance, right, this notion, even if we can't ever define precisely, clearly and distinctly what that importance is. And so Stengers wants to maintain this capacity to brood over that which science and even metaphysics can't finally define. When we do seek understanding in Whitehead's sense, we're seeking a kind of aesthetic achievement. We're seeking a kind of satisfaction, an experiential satisfaction, a sense of intellectual satisfaction, but it has this aesthetic quality which for Whitehead signals some inchoate grasp of the whole, of the totality. When we understand something, we see the whole, we feel the whole. And then we can analyze this whole metaphysically or scientifically, but always in an open-ended way, maintaining a sense for the feeling of the totality and never forgetting that our abstract analyses presuppose the feeling of the whole. And there's no way to explain, by reference to the abstractions that we come up with in our analysis, the concreteness from which they derive and from which they gain their meaning, right? In Whitehead's sense, abstraction cannot explain concreteness. It's always concreteness that will explain abstraction. Stengers then talks about the bifurcation of nature, which again is what Galileo engaged in when he separated the primary characteristics of mass and the dimensionality of physically extended objects and so on from the secondary characteristics of perception, colors, sounds, tastes, and so on, everything added by subjectivity, right? For Galileo, all that stuff is not in nature. What's in nature are just the measurable, mathematizable characteristics. And so this bifurcation of nature has been characteristic of modern science, right? And it's a rather violent form of abstraction, right? That severs nature right down the middle. And Whitehead is seeking an unbifurcated view of nature where for the purposes of science, we could define nature as just everything that we are aware of in perception. So that includes, all the stuff Galileo wants to measure and quantify, but it also includes qualities, right? It's not just the wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation that a physicist might measure. It's the red hue of the sunset that can matter to us, and indeed the warmth of the sunset that can matter to us, not just a sort of statistical account of temperature as vibrating molecules. Warmth and color are as much a part of nature as electromagnetic wavelengths and so on. This is Whitehead's unbifurcated view of nature, but it's apparent that at least in physics, science can kind of get away with this bifurcation, right? Because in the physical world, in the pre-biological world, these general laws seem to hold, at least well enough for the purposes of making pretty accurate predictions based on mathematical models. But we know that these laws are statistical, and we also know that in the biological world, general laws don't really hold anymore. It's not useful for science when it's engaging with the living world, with the biosphere, with organisms, to try to find general laws, because in the biological world, we're always dealing with individual organisms. And each organism, in each situation it finds itself in, is making some unique decision. And biologists have to study the creativity of these organisms in order to characterize them scientifically, right? Organisms don't just mutely persist in a law-like way. Organisms instead must continually strive to maintain themselves, right? They exist moment by moment as an achievement, not just a sort of inert fact, but as an activity. And further, when we study living organisms, they're aware of our presence. They respond to our ways of engaging with them. So there's a kind of feedback here, right? And just as, 20th century physics and the issue of the observer and measurement in quantum theory raised the problem of the subject and its relationship to the object in a way that science hadn't had to deal with for the first few hundred years of its existence, this modern mechanistic form of science. In biology, it's even more obvious, right, that the way that we observe and attempt to measure is going to affect how that which we are observing behaves. Now, when Stengers introduces Whitehead's, really one of his most important concepts, the actual occasion or the actual entity, she's careful to point out that this is a metaphysical abstraction, right? But it's the work it's attempting to do is, again, to increase our vigilance of the way in which experience is shaped by abstraction. And so an actual entity, an actual occasion, is an event with a kind of individual discreteness, right? And Stengers characterizes an actual occasion as, she says, actual occasions constitute elemental stitches of all that is in the making. And an actual occasion, it's both a subject and an object at different phases of its process. And in this sense, Stengers contrasts what Whitehead does with his actual occasion or actual entity to what Kant was forced to do in his philosophy, his transcendental idealism, where the subject is divided off from the object. These are two very different modes of being in Kant's philosophy, where the subject is self-determining, it's free, and it's constructing its world of objects. Objects are just given and determined by this activity. Now, there's a kind of bifurcation here in Kant between the decisions that would be made by free subjects and the causes and effects that determine nature. In Whitehead's account of the actual occasion as both a subject and an object, or a subject and a superject, as he will say, cause and decision are no longer bifurcated, right? Every actual occasion of experience is a decision, and its subjectivity, its existence as a subject, is constituted by the decision it makes about how to inherit its past and how to influence its future. A decision is made that unifies the multitude of facts inherited from the past, and there's a new perspective on the universe achieved, a unique, once occurrent perspective achieved. And part of that achievement is also an aim at the future, right? But the actual occasion can only affect the future by perishing, right? Because it achieves the satisfaction of its novel perspective and immediately perishes out of subjectivity into superjectivity, or Whitehead will also say, into objective immortality. And it gifts the value it has achieved, the perspective it has won, to the future to be taken up by the next occasion of experience. And so here, there is a flow of causes from the past, but those causes are not determining what happens in the present. What's determining what happens in the present is the way a subject, an actual occasion of experience, receives and interprets that past and values that past. It makes a decision about how to affect the future. So the way occasions make decisions like this, inheriting a past, anticipating a future, suggests that nature is not just a collection of facts, not just what is the case, but nature is also full of possibilities. It's permeated by possibilities. Even the past is inherited with a sense of what could have been but was not. Right? And so, decisions are made by each actual occasion about what to include and what to exclude. But whatever is excluded leaves a kind of scar, a kind of emotional echo that signals to us the contingency of the past and thus the openness of the future. Right? And so, an example of this would be that, I have a certain emotion that arises when, I'm looking to the right and I step out onto the street and a car to my left honks its horn and I turn and stop just in time to avoid being hit. What am I feeling in that moment? Well, a mix of fear and relief, but the emotions I feel in the present are not a response to what did happen. I didn't get hit by the car. They're a response to what could have happened, right? And so in this way, when we understand what it means to inherit the facts of the past, we have to include a sense of an awareness of what was not, but may have been, right? So possibility in this sense haunts actuality. Stengers then introduces Whitehead's idea of societies, which is a kind of further generalization later in the development of his work of the idea of organism. So in Science in the Modern World, which Whitehead wrote in 1925, he talked about organisms, and he really wanted to develop a sense of nature as composed of organisms, from physics, which studies this particle physics, which studies the smaller organisms, and biology, which studies the middle-sized organisms, and astrophysics, which studies the larger organisms, stars and galaxies, and so on. But in Process and Reality, he still makes use of this analogy of the organism, but he develops this somewhat more general concept of a society. Now, what's the difference between an actual occasion and a society? Well, occasions arise and perish, right? They do not endure through physical time, and they do not change. They are what they are. Once they've achieved their decision, they have objective immortality, right? And so you kind of have to stretch your imagination a bit here. Whitehead's describing a kind of process that goes on in the concrescence of an actual occasion that is not in physical time. So this process within concrescence that constitutes an actual occasion is immeasurable. It's not something that a clock could track as it moves from phase to phase. Actual occasions, once they concress and are inherited by subsequent actual occasions, this process of inheritance and transition from one stitch to the next stitch weaves together what we call time, and indeed space-time in a relativistic context, right? And so physical time, physical space are a consequence of the decisions of actual occasions as to how they are to stitch themselves together, to stitch the past to the future through the present as a result of decision. So we have to imagine a different kind of process when we're talking about an actual occasion of experience. When we're talking about a society, we're talking about a kind of lineage of occasions that achieves a definite characteristic despite the fact that societies are continually changing. So anything in our experience that endures, which is basically everything that we usually experience, is a society, right? A table, a chair, a teacup, societies of actual occasions. A blade of grass, a tree, a bird, a society of actual occasions. Really a multitude of societies of actual occasions, right? So a human body as an organism, as a society, is really a society of societies. Each of our organ systems has its own sort of characteristic style of growth and decay and metamorphosis. But because the human body is this kind of interrelated system of centers of experience, there's a participation of each part in the construction of all the other parts and then the construction of the whole. And what we experience as our stream of consciousness from moment to moment is just sort of one lineage of occasions within the society of societies, which constitutes our organism. And each of these societies creates a kind of shelter or filter for that stream of occasions that Whitehead says is sort of flitting through the brain from moment to moment. The rest of the body creates a kind of filter that amplifies our experience of the environment, and the various sensory organs are specific channels for such amplification, and they all feed into this, what he'll call the dominant occasion of experience, right, our stream of consciousness. But even here there are, we each have kind of multiple personalities to some degree, or if you think in terms of Carl Jung's psychology or James Hillman's psychology, there's many archetypes at play in our psyche aside from just the ego. And even the ego, really, there's like multiple drafts of our self-sense, you might say, right? And we're always in conversation between different aspects of ourself. And so, unity and multiplicity are exactly what's at issue when we're talking about societies. And you need to, again, have a flexible imagination to grok what Whitehead is talking about here. If we were to analyze a society at any given moment of its life history, then we'd be talking about an actual occasion, right? But when we talk about how bodies persist through space-time, we're always, in that case, talking about a society, right? Now, these are abstractions. These are tools for thinking with and tools for eliciting new thoughts, right? And it might take some time to get used to thinking with and speaking in terms of Whitehead's language. But once you do begin to internalize this way of conceptualizing and analyzing your experience, I think it elucidates that experience. It allows you to become more aware of the way in which your concepts and your words are not just describing something given, but in fact, the way you speak and think is part of what's bringing forth the very structure of the world and of your experience. So I'm going to say a few words about Chapter 5 of Whitehead's Modes of Thought, which is titled Forms of Process. I want to zero in on what he says about mathematics and the interplay between the supposedly eternal truths of mathematics and the facts of history, the process of the world, of cosmogenesis. How is it that, on the one hand, mathematics gives us such deep insight into the rhythms and the patterns that shape the world process, the physical world, but on the other hand, the sort of existence that philosophers have attributed to numbers and to mathematical forms has been a kind of eternal existence, a kind of static existence removed from or transcendent in relationship to the physical world. This is, of course, the Platonic point of view. And, Whitehead is a kind of Neoplatonist, and he admits his debt to Plato and thinks all philosophy in Europe and in the West is indebted to Plato. But he's critical of Plato's tendency to imagine the realm of forms as this static, eternal kind of heaven at a remove from, entirely abstracted from, the world of physical process. Whitehead wants to emphasize this other doctrine in Plato of life and motion, the idea of the soul of the world as ensouled, as Plato describes it in his cosmological dialogue, the Timaeus. And so Whitehead wants to bring mathematical forms back into process and show how numbers, for example, are arithmetic is not a display of the eternal truths of numerical patterns, but that these patterns are themselves processes. But we've generally, mathematicians over the course of history, since mathematics was discovered, have not recognized this processual dimension of math. They've instead focused, again, on the eternal side of it. And so in this way, math has certainly advanced human understanding, but Whitehead says it's also introduced novel modes of error. Because it turns out, and Whitehead would know, having authored Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell, trying to ground mathematics, arithmetic in particular, in logic, the logic of sets. He knows a little bit about the logical status of numbers, and he says there's no such entity as a mere static number, right? Numbers are relational entities, and they're processes. They issue in forms of process which become the data for further forms of process, right? And so how do these truths of mathematics, how does the multiplication table, for example, relate to the heartbeat or the weather patterns of the earth, or to the ion channels and the membranes of cells? How is it that we can gain a kind of mathematical understanding of these cosmic processes? Well, it's clear that nature exemplifies mathematical form. And this exemplification is a kind of participation. And for Whitehead, he does borrow this Platonic notion of participation to understand the relationship between eternal form and actual fact. But he inverts it, because for Whitehead, what's truly valuable and important and what has preeminent reality are not the forms, but the actual occasions of experience. And so he's trying to incarnate form into fact. And you might question, as Whitehead himself does, whether this throwing into motion of form threatens the very possibility of a rational accounting of things. Because reason, intellect, generally, they think in terms of, well, generalities, in terms of general rules that apply across all instances. And if reality is a process of unique occurrences, how can we determine them? How can we think these unique occurrences in terms of universal rules? And, Whitehead admits that here logic and math display their limits. Reality is not a deterministic equation or machine. But there's another means of gaining a kind of knowledge and understanding the relationship between form and fact. And for Whitehead, that's analogy. The method of rationality for Whitehead is analogy. We're comparing this to that, not to erase the differences, right, but to discover identities amidst diversities. And so Whitehead's whole philosophy is an attempt to look at all the special sciences and draw analogies between them so that we can begin to see how an account of the transmission of physical energy in some ways also reveals something about the flow of emotion in our psychological experience, and vice versa, right? These two extremes of reality can be compared to each other, not identified, but compared, and we can see what the underlying similarities might be. In chapter 5, Whitehead also talks about God and the function of God in the world process. And he says that God's role is to sustain the aim at vivid experience by acting as a reservoir of potentiality, and to coordinate the achievement of value by the multitude of finite actual occasions. Now, God is also, in Whitehead's scheme, an actual entity, right? God doesn't exist beyond the categories which Whitehead wants to use and the analogies which Whitehead wants to use to think about everything else that there is. But God has a special role in that God's concrescence is primordial. God doesn't have a history. God is the first creature of creativity, you might say, and sort of sets the tone that all subsequent creatures will resonate with to some degree. God is, in each occasion of experience, trying to instigate more vivid experience, more beauty. But God's not determining how each occasion will decide to achieve its satisfaction and to enjoy its experience. But God acts as a lure, and as the world process unfolds and countless occasions of experience arise and perish, there's an accumulation of value, and that accumulation is one of God's other functions. There's the primordial nature, and then Whitehead also has a consequent nature of God, and the consequent nature of God is kind of like a cosmic memory that's coordinating what's been achieved by each occasion as it arises and perishes, and holding up that achievement as an eternal fact, which will influence all subsequent facts, right? All future occasions will feel what has happened. And so Whitehead has this sense of a deity in his philosophy. It's not a God separate from the world. It's not a God that creates the world. It's a God that functions as a reservoir of potentiality, providing us with an ideal to aim at, and a God which also functions as a coordinator and a gatherer of everything which has already happened so that it can continue to feed the future. And, Whitehead thinks that we have this experiential intuition of this kind of a deity, this kind of a God, in our entertainment of ideals. He thinks that we can directly experience the fact that there is value in the world outside of ourselves. Right? There is some external standard of success or failure in the achievement of our own values, because we know that there's value beyond ourselves. We want to contribute to it. We want to experience it. And so, consider Whitehead's theology as quite heterodox and more of a metaphysician's God than a God of religious belief, though certainly if one considers this speculative construction of this kind of God, religious feelings might be elicited.